Hello and welcome to lessons 4 and 5 of global development. This session is going to be looking at how development varies. So we're going to be looking at both how it varies globally for the first session, and then we're going to be moving on to how it varies in the UK specifically. So this image illustrates quite nicely how global development can vary. And what you've got here is an image of a city you might find in maybe a developing country. And then you've got an image of Manhattan in New York City, the United States of America. And this is just the quality of buildings really being associated. If you went to the streets of New York City, traffic-wise, it probably looked pretty similar. Having been there myself, it is a bit of a free-for-all. But development varies in a number of ways globally, and sometimes it can be an obvious thing that you can see from just an image, but otherwise there's other aspects at play which aren't as visible on the surface. So we're going to investigate how development and why development varies globally. So this is the learning objective for today. Understand how different factors, and we're going to group them into social, historical, environmental, economic and political, and how those factors have influenced the development in different countries and in different ways. Okay, so this is a bit of a recap from last session, and this hopefully is something that you can do pretty quickly. What I'd like you to do is look at this population pyramid of the United Kingdom, and on this population pyramid I'd like you to try and work out or identify some key aspects. Okay, so looking at the bottom of the pyramid, looking at the top of the pyramid, any other aspects you could tell me. So try and think of 3 things you could tell me about this country's development based solely on this population pyramid. So pause the screen, have a little look at it, try and analyse it, and then unpause the screen when you're ready, and I will go through some of the bits you might have got. Okay, so first thing I would say is that there is a low but stable birth rate, suggesting it's a developed country. We know it's the UK, I already told you that. So low or stable birth rate, high life expectancy. You can see that there is a clear bulge in the working population, okay, which is good for now, not so good later on when these people come through. This might suggest immigration, or it might suggest a baby boom or something like that. And you could see that there's a gender imbalance. There are more old females than there are men in the country. You could say that the death rates are low, hence why it's still got wide sides and quite sort of steep sides all the way. It doesn't actually go towards a point at the top. So they're all key things you really should have got from looking at this population pyramid. And I identified that it's an aging population would be something maybe that's good, and nearly, like Japan, an aged population too, to be honest. Right. So that summarises last lesson, and today's session is going to be a lot of note taking with me doing a bit of explanation over the top of it. So it's a very straightforward one for you to follow, this one. So something called the Brandt report is really important when it comes to identifying the difference between developed and developing nations in the world. And it's quite an old report, and there are things in it that are outdated. But in 1980, a chap called Brandt published his report, which essentially highlighted the difference globally between the rich and the poor. Okay, and he identified 2 main groups of countries: what he called the global north, which is a bit weird, and you'll see in a minute, but global north, which were largely wealthy countries in North America, so USA, Canada, Western Europe, us, France, Germany, etc., Japan, and Australasia, which is not in the north of the world, but that's kind of an exception. Now, they were classed as the high-income countries, okay, and they were largely in the northern hemisphere. Now, the global south, which is the logical next step, they were generally the poorer countries, so Latin American countries, South American countries, African, Asian, and they were classed as the LICs, or the low-income countries, and they were predominantly in the south or the southern hemisphere. And other things that kind of came out of it were the differences or the inequalities between those 2 groups in terms of their development and their rates of development was known as the north-south divide, for obvious reasons, or more kind of accurately, the development gap. Okay, the gap between the wealthy and the less wealthy, or the more developed and the less developed. So that's the Brandt report, and obviously 1980 is even before I was born, so it's quite an old report, and it's outdated. And since then, a lot of countries have moved forward quite significantly with regards to their development. But just for now, you need to pause the screen to write these notes down, and then when you're ready, unpause, and then we'll carry on. So these maps are really handy. They illustrate what's happened to the share of global wealth over a 100-year period, or more than 100 years, and you can just see what's changed. So this is a world map, but not as we know it. It's been distorted to change the proportion of the country's size according to how wealthy they are. So at this particular stage in the world, you can see here, which is the United States of America, which is plus Alaska, those two, they are probably the biggest single country in terms of wealth on the planet. Then you've got us. Now we clearly in 1900 are a big player. You can see how wealthy we are in terms of our global proportion of wealth. Germany over here and France, both wealthy, in Western Europe. India, fairly wealthy, not doing too badly with a big population. China and Japan, they are where you'd put sort of most of the wealth in the world in the year 1900. Now, as we move on to 1960, I should say, not loads has changed. Okay, I'm just going to skip back. Okay, but what's happened is there's been a less wealth in China and India, and Western Europe has slightly declined relative to the United States, which has really boomed. The United States has now established itself by 1960 as easily the wealthiest state on the planet. So big change is really occurring in the USA. Japan has also nearly doubled in terms of its wealth in that period. Now moving on to 1990, okay, the big mover here is Japan. So you can see again, just based on 1960, the USA has got less wealthy in relation to the rest of the countries. By the way, not less wealthy. No country here has got less wealthy. Or some might have, but they've all got more wealthy. It's just the share of global wealth. So they have a slightly lesser share, because Japan, you can see on the right in dark purple over here, has absolutely boomed. And this has been the technology revolution really in Japan, with their manufacturing skills of car manufacturing and other gadgets and gizmos. There's no mystery as to why a lot of the electronic products that are bought and sold were initially established in Japan. And then looking on to 2015 and this other massive change, you can see now the growth of China. The green has absolutely taken over in a very short space of time, and now has a huge proportion of the world's wealth. Japan still has a big portion of the world's wealth too, but all the while, throughout the whole period, you can see that actually Europe and Western Europe's influence in terms of global wealth declines. It's just gone less and less and less and less. Okay, the USA has remained fairly stable. Okay, China has gone from being quite a large proportion to much less to a tiny bit more to a massive boom, and Japan really boomed in the 90s and has lost some of its share of wealth overall because of China really taking some competition away. So that shows you how global wealth has changed country by country over a 115 or so year period. There's huge changes going on there for various reasons. Now that wealth is obviously linked to development, because the wealthier you are, the more or less developed you can be, and that's what the Brandt line really focused on. It focused on the high income countries and the low income countries. Now in 365 there is a blank world map for you, but if you want to cheat, you can just Google Brandt line world map and it will give you a ready-made copy, so you don't have to plot this wibbly wobbly line across a world map. That's if you're in class, I'd make you do that. But you can see that the Brandt line focuses mostly separating the north and the south, but it also then does a little bit of a weird thing going on down here, just to make sure that Australia and New Zealand and Australasia and Oceania are included in the global north, which are the developed nations. Now you'll see in the developing south, you've got China, you've got India, you've got Brazil, Mexico. They're all countries that are developing, and actually probably you can't class them as the poor south anymore, or the global south anymore, because they are now moving, well, particularly looking at the last image. Look, India, wealthiest country on the planet in terms of their GDP equivalent. So big changes really have happened, so the Brandt report is a bit out of date, but you just need to be aware of that first north-south divide. Okay, now global shares of wealth, and again it's more notes I'm afraid. If we shared the wealth of the world evenly, everyone would have enough money to develop themselves evenly. and development would be an even thing. Now we know that the whole lesson being uneven development in the world, or global development, is it shows you that it's not even, essentially. And every year, all the countries that can, most countries in the world submit their GDP data. So the worth of their country, all the value of their goods and services, and they submit that data to the World Bank, who are this organisation made up of a group of different nations. In 2014, that's the sort of the best figures I've got for you. As there's definitely more up-to-date figures than that, but the cumulative GDP of 2014 was $78 trillion, which is not a made-up number. Okay, 78 trillion, I believe, is a million billion. I think it's a million billion, which is a lot. It's a lot of zeros, basically. And what the World Bank then do is they work out, based on these figures that are submitted, they work out how the wealth is spread. But they can do it in rank order, so think of it as like a league table in football. The one with the biggest GDP is the USA. They're number one. They're winning the league. They're currently Man City, last season Liverpool, future maybe Norwich, you never know. So they are the top. They've got 17 trillion, or they contributed in 2014 anyway, $17 trillion worth of that $78 trillion. So a big chunk. They were nearly a quarter of that whole figure. Tuvalu, Pacific Island, they were at the bottom. They were ranked at 230. So they had much, much lower contribution. But there's a number of factors at play. I mean, Tuvalu don't have a very big population. The USA has over 300 million people. So as a result of that, it's not going to, Tuvalu's never going to generate as much wealth as the workforce of 300 odd million people can. So that's one of the factors. Size is an important thing to consider. Another thing that the World Bank do is they then divide up, and they can either do it by country or by population, and it's often by population. So if they work out the whole world's population, and then they proportion it into 5 equal bands. Okay, so imagine the world's population was 10 billion. It's not, but imagine it was. It would be 2 billion in each band. And we call those quintiles. And what they do is they kind of essentially use those numbers, those countries, all those populations, depending on what you're looking at. Okay, population is normally the one they show, but it could be country by country. And so they'll do the 46 richest countries in the top band, the next 46, the next 46, next 46, and that'll all add up to 230. Or they could do it by population, which my next slide shows us. And this is quite stark. So again, make sure you've got these notes written down. When you're ready, you can move on. This is what we call a champagne glass distribution, okay, for obvious reasons. It looks a bit like an old school champagne glass. Now this one shows population rather than 46 countries. And in terms of population, the top quintile, so the top fifth of the world's population, hold 83% of all global wealth. Okay, and in 2014 that was $64.74 trillion. So 83% of the entire global wealth was effectively held by just 1/5 of the world's population. The second band held 11.7%. Okay, so nearly 12% of the world's wealth. So the second 20%. So within the top 40% of the world's population, there is 93 to 94% of all the wealth in the world. And just that two-fifths. For the remaining quintiles, they're basically scrabbling around for scraps. There's less than 6% of wealth available, or stored in or held by the bottom 60% of the world's population. Okay, so this shows you a really unevenness of wealth very, very clearly. The richest are really, really rich, whereas the poorest, in fact the second poorest and the third poorest, are essentially sharing very limited amounts between them. Alright, there's not much to choose between these, whereas up here you've got a massive difference, and that is effectively to do with the development gap, and that's something which illustrates the wealth gap hugely. Okay, I'm just going to move on to the next bit. So obviously we know that things have changed since the Brandt report, because I've been hinting at that for this session anyway. In the 1980s, rapid development took place in places like Brazil and Chile as well, and those countries, we'll talk about China in a second, but the countries that started to have rapid development for one reason or another, places like Brazil, Chile, became middle income countries. So a new category kind of was formed. It wasn't just the Hicks and the Licks anymore, it was the mix as well. And that was because they had large amounts of natural resources to exploit. So things like coal and oil, and that helped their cities grow in population and helped their wealth develop because they could then sell that to other nations. And then in the 90s, so sort of a decade later, Asia's turn started to develop. Now remember, you saw on the map, in the 90s was when Japan really boomed, and then China, 10 to 15 years later, has absolutely dominated in terms of global wealth. And in China's case, that was because of their manufacturing industry, so they're a newly industrializing country. And Japan's case, even before Japan was a big player, but when they started to develop their technology industry, that was a sort of a new industry to them. That helped them really boom. And lots of other nations around there, like Malaysia, for example, Indonesia, are known as the Asian tigers. And their Asian tiger economies doubled in size since the 90s. So they are the newly industrializing countries. So you've got your Hicks, high-income countries, Licks, low-income countries, Mix, middle-income countries, and Nicks, newly industrializing countries. So the Hicks, Licks, Mix, and Licks. You got all that? Good, me neither. This really just shows you that the Brant Report is out of date and things and development has moved on. And it's not just as simple as rich and poor. There's a lot more at play, particularly going on currently in the world with regards to these Mix and Nicks as well. Okay, so another page of notes you've got to make sure you get before you can move on, please. And when you're ready, please do. All right, so I said this is lesson 4 and 5 of global development, and this really is going to be now moving on to the second part. So the first part was looking at uneven development globally, and today we're going to be looking at uneven development in the UK. Okay, but we're also going to look at some of the reasons why globally uneven development takes place. So essentially, I've got a summary of a few things that you can put side by side, which you can get for your notes now. We can put into the factors that affect even development globally into 3 categories: physical categories, historical, and economic. And those same 3 categories can be used to explain the UK's factors and why the UK isn't evenly developed. So on the left-hand side, global development, this is like country by country. Why is the USA more developed than Kenya, for example? Okay, why is one part of the UK, London, more developed than Newcastle or Sunderland, for example? That's the difference in what we're looking at. These are more regional, these things. So in terms of global factors, physical factors, naturally occurring, can't do anything about kind of thing. How big the country is. That can be used both ways. Again, size of a country, in terms of your population, might be a good thing. It might mean you've got lots of natural resources to exploit. That's certainly the case for Brazil and how they start to develop, and China. Do you suffer with natural hazards, earthquakes, volcanoes, tsunamis? Again, the more natural hazards you have, the more likely you are to be struggling with development, because every time you build something, it gets basically knocked down again. What's your climate like? Is it good for growing crops? Is it good for developing an agricultural industry, which then everything can bounce from or move on from? Physical factors that affect UK regionally are more to do with, have we got mountainous areas? Have we got hilly areas? And we know that we do, the highlands and parts of the northwest of the UK. And what natural resources there are. Again, Sunderland is a good example. In the northeast particularly, developed quite well in the early 1900s because of its coal industry, coal mining, which was the backbone of the Industrial Revolution and making energy in factories. But as coal industry has declined in the UK, so have the jobs, essentially. So natural resources now rely on things like, have you got a port near to you? Have you got a coastline, which means you can export easily? Historical factors, globally, colonial links are a big thing, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And trading relationships, how established those trading relationships might be between you and other nations. When it comes to UK's factors that affect development. This is I hinted this already with regards to Sunderland. They deindustrialised. Every city that deindustrialised suffered with unemployment, and if they haven't then boosted their level of employment through another industry developing, or maybe financial sector or something, then they never maybe will recover that wealth, and so that can lead to uneven development. Economic factors include things like the type of industry that you've got. If it's largely agricultural, if you're a country which is mainly agricultural and you have a bad harvest, then your income is gone. But if your industry is varied and you've got things like finance, tourism, much safer industries, then you're more likely to have a reliable amount of income, and therefore your development will be better. Debt. Are you a country that has had to borrow a lot and not been able to pay off that money? Again, this relates to lots of African nations, which links into colonial links in a minute I'll talk about. Have you invested in health and education? You'll look at this far more when we look at India as a case study later, but India's success has really been built around a combination of its size, its climate, its colonial links and trading relationships, type of industry, and investment in health and education. And a lot of these bullet points that India has played in its favour mean that it's developed rapidly. Same thing in the UK. Type of industry. If you were a coal mining industry place, then again you would suffer, whereas if you were a financial sector, you'd be fine. Employment rates, house prices can be a factor, salaries, and how connected you are. Do you have motorways? Do you have airports? That will affect your ability to develop. Norwich is sometimes seen as something which struggles to develop too much because its road network's pretty poor. Not a single mile of motorway in the whole city, in the whole county of Norfolk, but it's still connected because it can go via Schiphol. But if you're in a remote area, you can't get goods in and out, you're not going to develop really much of an industry. So there you go, there's a good summary of the two side by side, the reasons and the categories, physical, historical, economic, for both global uneven development and UK specific uneven development. Now this is what I was talking to you about with colonial links. This is the continent of Africa, and you can see here how Africa used to be divided up according to which nations essentially controlled it as a colony. Now you can see the UK was a big player, as is France and Italy as well, and you've got Holland, the Netherlands, I should say, Spain as well, some of them, Germany, also Belgium in central here, not Germany, Belgium. Effectively, African nations gained independence, and when they gained independence, they either were left with corrupt governments, which filtered off money, or there was conflict between who should take power. And one really good example is Rwanda, and there's a good film called Hotel Rwanda, which I'd urge you to watch at some point. It's pretty harrowing, but it's very, very good, and it really starts off by the story of there's a massive genocide between two tribes in Rwanda, the Hutu and the Tutsi, and the Hutu and the Tutsi are basically at loggerheads with each other, and it's all based around Belgian occupation originally, where the Belgians introduced identity cards and segregated the two tribes, and then when they left and Rwanda gained independence, it essentially was left in a state of instability, which meant that they go to conflict, which then affected their development long term, and that's why they're really struggling to develop now, even still. So a lot of these nations, including the UK, just kind of left. And one of these countries, if they were in a place where they wanted to develop and they borrowed money, they're now addled with massive debt as well, which they can't necessarily pay off unless they're a success story. There are some success stories, but there's slower development going on in African nations than lots of other parts of the world. So, urban development within countries, and this is we're going to focus on the UK, and the example would love a UK focused pretty much to every topic, even if it's just a small amount. So this topic is really dominated by looking at India, but the UK is going to be hinted at with regards to how uneven development can occur within a country. So on 365 is this this UK handout, which explains lots about the difference between the northeast of England and other parts and the southeast, essentially. And it's got your stats, facts, figures, and lots of detail. With anything I give you, the handout with the information, I don't want you just to read it or just stick it in your book and never look at it ever again. Print this off and read it through really, take your time. Take 10 minutes to do it properly. Highlight anything specific, any specific detail, any reasons why the UK is more or less developed in certain parts than others. Okay, and this will give you a really good overview with some stats about how uneven development can occur within a country, and specifically the United Kingdom. Okay. Once you've done that, you can unpause the screen, and we'll do the rest of the session. So, as a kind of a build on from that particular bit of work, which if you've done properly, this will be a lot easier. There's another handout on Office 365, which you can see on the screen now. This handout has got 12 categories, all of which are reasons why the UK has uneven development. Okay, but also there are global development factors here too. Now, what I would like you to do, okay, because remember it's both global and potentially national development, but this is more of a focus on global, actually, I would say. So these are all reasons why development can vary globally. But I want you to read them and categorize them. So tell me, are they a historical or political reason? Are they a physical factor, physical reason why development is uneven? Or are they a socio-economic reason, so to do with money, jobs, that sort of thing? So for example, location. Some places are near to the sea, so can trade and make money. Because you're near to the sea, that's a physical factor. Okay, even though it's about trading and making money, which is an economic factor, the location, the fact that you're near the sea, is the factor that affects development. So if you're near the sea, it can help you trade, make more money. That's a physical reason, so I'd colour code that physical. Okay, so read it through, work out if it's historical, political, physical, or socio-economic. Okay, and add a key as well. So pause the screen, do that, colour code it, make sure you've got a key. Okay, here is a summary of what should be what. Okay, so historical, political are the blue ones, colonisation, war and corruption. Physical reasons are location, geography, natural resources, natural hazards and climate. And socio-economic reasons, trade, overpopulation, tourism and discrimination. So check your answers against this. If you've got any wrong, please just make sure you correct them. But this gives you a brilliant summary of 3 categories of reason for why global development can be uneven. And rather than just the table I showed you right at the early stages of this has actually got a little bit of an explanation added to it as well. So you've got like an extended reason for why different places can develop in different rates. Okay, so once you finish that, please move on to the next slide. So the last thing you need to do, and this really is going to take the majority of the time. Remember, this is 2 lessons, so it's a 2-hour session in terms of time it should take you. What I'd like you to do is, using the scanned pages from the Highland Cow textbook, so 204 and 205, which are in 365, okay, Office 365, using those, firstly, read them through, and then summarize the information from those 2 pages into a mega mind map, okay, into basically a double page spread in your book with 3 headings. Firstly, causes of global inequality. Now this should be easy. We've covered stuff like this and I've explained some of these things already to you. I need a summary of everything I've covered basically. We want reasons for inequality in the UK. I've given you a fact sheet from last lesson, or not from last lesson, sorry, from this session. So I've given you a fact sheet. Ignore it says last lesson. You can use that plus the book. And this one is the different one. Okay, this one I haven't talked to you about at all. You need to also cover impacts of uneven development. So what are the specific impacts on access to housing, health, education, employment, technology, food and water security? These specific areas, I want you to cover every single one of these as a little subheading within your mind map, please. Alright, so impacts of uneven development, really focus on this because the other 2 I've talked to you a lot about. I want you to get everything done in a summary, double page summary, using 204, 205 and the sheet I've given you, but make sure you get every single one of these and make sure you are spending more time reading about impacts of uneven development with regards to access to housing, health, education, employment, tech, food and water security. Okay, that should take you 20 minutes, 25 minutes easily, probably half an hour if you're doing a good job. Okay, so make sure you spend the time to do that properly. Pause the screen, and then when you're ready you can unpause the screen for a bit of a final part. Okay, so I always like to give you exam practice, and this is no exception. So what I'd like you to do, and this, if you did last lesson, we talked about explaining things. I would like you to develop your answers, but it says explain why some countries are more developed than others. It doesn't specify explain one reason. It doesn't say two reasons, so I would go with two reasons because it doesn't specify just one. So explain why some countries are more developed than others, and really this is just an exam-based way of asking you what have you learnt from today's lesson. So why are some countries, and this is global, so it's talking about countries, why are some places in the world more developed than others? You need to name a reason and explain why that reason makes it more or less developed, please. Okay, so use connectives, which means that, this is because, whatever you might want to use, but you must use connectives. I want two reasons that are developed to explain why that factor makes them more or less developed. Okay, so get that practice done. As ever, if you want to show me your answers, you want to send me them to me, email them, bring them in next lesson, then please feel free. But there we go, we're just trying to apply your knowledge to an exam scenario. Alright, that is essentially the end of the lesson. Okay, there is another one, by the way, if you wanted to do this one. This is specific to the UK, so this is another example you could use that's not just global. This one now gets you the same question. It could be an exam question, but this is about inequality in the UK. So that you got one about more developed countries, so global, or another one where you could just focus on just the UK. And if you want to practice both, and again, show me both, please feel free. So mark a minute, try and time yourself, no more than 4 minutes, 5 minutes maximum for each question. And that really is the end of the session. So well done for getting through it. That concludes development 4 and 5, and I will see you next time for development 6. Thanks for listening.